All right, moving back to politics now, and I'm joined live from Victoria by Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for your company.
Always a pleasure, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Less of a pleasure, though, at the moment, presumably, courtesy of all the infighting that's going on your side of politics. Tony Abbott was being critical again this morning on radio. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that it's a right for backbenchers to speak their mind, but is he going a little further than that in your view?
Oh, Peter, your company's always a pleasure. Don't let yourself down like that. Peter, the only leadership contest I'm really interested in talking about today is the one between Lee Rhiannon and Richard Di Natale. I'm backing Lee's plan to put a vote in the hands of Greens members around the country to choose the next leader, because the question Greens members have to answer is, do they really want a neoliberal on a bike like Richard Di Natale, or a tree Tory like Peter Whish-Wilson, or do they want a real genuine watermelon like Lee Rhiannon to lead them?
Is your view that they're nearly as divided as you like?
Peter, I've never seen every single one of my colleagues sign a letter to another one of my colleagues to take them up on their bad behaviour. That's a whole new level, I think.
They've never knocked off a leader in their first term, though, particularly
well,
in
they've
government.
never been in government, so it's a little bit hard, and may that long be the case.
But, Senator, even when they're not in government, where leaders are arguably at their weakest, they've still never knocked off a first-term leader.
Oh, Peter, I think you know as well as I do that the internal dynamics of the Greens can be pretty vicious at times, and certainly, particularly under Christine Milne's leadership, it was a very unhappy den.
That is true. But look, I do need to get a reaction from you, and we can move on. I don't want to sort of turn this into the entire interview, but I do need to get a reaction to some of the internals, because it is a distraction. Arthur Sinodinos, he was interviewed earlier this morning. He was reflecting on this and he was engaging with it. He made the point that the executive can't control Tony Abbott. Here's my question for you in essence, and then we'll move on to some policy matters, including the jobs announcement today if we can. But is it your view that Tony Abbott, speaking as freely and as frankly about things within the Liberal Party and problems, is it your view that it is helpful and a good illustration of the role of a backbencher, or is it your view that even if he's got some legitimate points that he's making, that it is something that is ill-timed and that is frustrating for a government that is trying to get its message, I suppose, through to voters?
One of the conclusions I've come to, Peter, in my short time in the Parliament, just over a year now, a little bit more than a year, is that internal debates, even those which sometimes spill out into the public arena on philosophical issues or policy disagreements, are quite a healthy and normal thing, and they should take place, and I think they can take place in a way that isn't a distraction and that doesn't harm the government's prospects. But that, I came in after the leadership change. Debates that occur in the context of leadership or through a prism of leadership, or which are interpreted by the media and played up by the media, are generally not helpful, because that's not what voters want. They might understand that politicians within a political party have different views and disagreements from time to time and think that's okay. What I think they are showing a very low tolerance for is this revolving door of leadership, and that if a debate is seen through that prism, it is generally very unhelpful.
You're not doing a Donald Trump on me, are you, Senator, and blaming us, the innocent media? A moment ago I was good company, now suddenly I'm part of this terrible vanguard causing your own problems inside the party with the way we amplify things. Well,
Peter, it mustn't be you. It must be just your colleagues in the media then who have a bit of a short attention span sometimes, and who show a bit more interest in a personality clash than a policy disagreement, or certainly like to amplify what may be an underlying personality disagreement in a policy issue. You know me, Peter. I'm here for the policy. I care about the ideas. That's what I'm focused on, and I enjoy engaging with my colleagues who have a different view on those things. And I think that's normal and being a healthy part of being in government, being in politics.
Okay, let's get into some of that. We'll put the personality out of the way, get rid of that P. Before we get to the policy P, we've got one more P to deal with, which is philosophy. I'm going to talk to a former IPA colleague of yours, still the ongoing executive director there, John Roscombe, later on Newsday. But he's made some really powerful comments. You must have seen them over the course of the weekend, really questioning the sort of philosophical principles and the way that the Liberal Party in government is functioning. Now, you and him, I wouldn't say you're torn from exactly the same cloth, but you've certainly got a lot philosophically in common on a range of issues. I mean, do you share that frustration and disappointment, I suppose, as part of the government, albeit on the backbench?
I did see John's comments over the weekend, and I think they were just a little bit harsh, Peter. I think, and I hope that when John comes on later, he acknowledges that under Malcolm Turnbull, we've done more to address free speech than any previous government. No government has ever put before to the Senate a bill to reform Section 18C, but this government did so under the Prime Minister's leadership. So, I mean, it's a constant battle, of course, between policy purity and philosophical purity and political pragmatism and populism. That every political party goes through that, and on some days we might lean more one way, and other days we might lean more the other. That's not unusual. Every government goes through that. Even the sainted Howard government had those internal debates about the size of government and whether middle class welfare was too generous, whether tax cuts went far enough. So it's normal for a body like the IPA to be critical of the party from time to time if it feels that we're not strictly on the straight and narrow philosophically. I don't think that's something that any of us should spend too much time worrying about. We should hear them and hear others who raise concerns, and we should take it into account, but we shouldn't lose sleep over it.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Howard years. I mean, is it a frustration for Liberals today, particularly next-generation Liberals like yourself, looking at all the baked-in spending that was put in place during the Howard years? And don't get me wrong, that was at a time where it was affordable to have such middle-class welfare. I'm thinking of family tax benefits, A and B and the like. There's been some reform of that, but not nearly as much, I'm guessing, Senator, as someone like you might like. Now that the times have changed, the good times of the Howard years where those sort of sops to the middle class via welfare handouts were affordable are just not affordable, but they're still locked in. And a lot of Liberals from that period, Mr Howard himself, it has to be said, seem to think that they need to stay in place, whereas younger generation Liberals, I'm guessing, like yourself, think that sort of thing has to be pulled out so that the size of government can come down.
Well, Peter, the Howard government was a very fiscally prudent government. It was the gold standard, but as you say, the times have changed. The economy is different to what it was then, and the revenue in particular available to government is perhaps not as dependable as it was in that era. It was a different economic era, and so we do have to make different choices. We have made some progress towards that goal of trimming down and reining in the size of government. There's been some changes to family tax benefits, for example. There's been greater means testing of some payments. Childcare payments is an example of that. They're more aggressively means tested than they were in the past. Clearly,
why not just get rid of all of that stuff, though, Senator? I mean, at the end of the day, why not get rid of all of that so that you can bring down taxes?
Well, clearly, Peter, with a budget deficit in the vicinity of $30 billion last financial year and a little bit less next year and a little bit less than the year after if we continue on the trajectory that we're on, there is still more work to be done to rein in spending and to keep it more competitive. I always favour, as far as possible, letting people keep as much of the money that they earn in the first place through lower taxes rather than taking it from them and giving it back to them in the form of another payment. So as far as possible, I think we can and we should do that. And we are moving in that direction. But of course, we need the agreement of the whole Parliament to do that, and that includes the Senate, where we don't have a majority. And some of our measures, which would move things in that direction, have not been supported in the Senate, and so that's an ongoing challenge for us.
What do you think about this whole notion from the announcement today around jobs, where for youths between, I think, the ages of 15 and 24, there'll be a sort of a handout to employers to encourage them to hire some people who are currently unemployed into jobs in the retail sector. Do you like that kind of bang for your buck? I mean, is there bang for your buck in that kind of a level of a handout, and how much training is really necessary? I spoke to Trent Zimmerman, who heads up the Retailers Association. He seemed to make it sound like we're talking about oodles of training, but do you need that much training to be able to go into the retail sector and do things like stack shelves and the like? It sounds to me like there could be some overkill in this in terms of government spending.
Well, Peter, one of the things we know about a young person when they're leaving formal education and hoping to enter into the workforce is that's a really critical time in their life. And research shows that the longer the gap between leaving formal education and entering the workforce, the worse over time you can expect their outcomes to be in terms of their employability in their long term, in terms of their reliance on welfare and all the other measures that are associated with that. So anything we can do to get people who are leaving the education system to get into the workforce as soon as possible and be gainfully employed as soon as possible is a really good thing. It will repay itself many times over. We've seen this work quite successfully in New Zealand, this kind of early intervention and investment model that over the long time saves the government and therefore society, the community, a great deal more in future welfare payments and other expenses by getting people into work early. So I think a program like this, which targets young people who are particularly vulnerable to that, is a really productive thing to do.
Just before we run out of time, Senator, I want to ask you about this whole concept of the same-sex marriage plebiscite versus the free vote. Now, I don't want you to weasel around answering this question for me. I want you to call it as you see it. I get that you're probably going to support the plebiscite. It was government policy at the last election. You don't want to be perceived to be breaking another promise, so you can put it up again, see how you go with it. Let's assume, though, that Labor don't move, and I know you'll be critical of that. That's not the question. Labor won't move. You won't be able to get it through the parliament because it'll get blocked in the Senate. Here's my question, Senator. What should, in your view, with the freedom of the backbench to express yourself, Craig Kelly offered me a view last week, what should, on the assumption that all of that happens, what should the party's policy be that you take to the next election? Should you take the plebiscite, in your opinion, to the next election, or should you go to another policy, say a free vote, after this term where you therefore haven't broken an election commitment?
Well, Peter, thank you for those narrow tram tracks you've given me to guide me in your preferred direction.
Well, otherwise you'll go off in a million different directions. I know, but I know you're as much of a straight talker as Craig Kelly, who gave me a straight answer on this one. So I'm eager to hear it, Senator.
Well, I'll try not to get too far off track, but it is worth pointing out, as others do in this space, that we have a policy which we took the election. My view is, for the duration of this term, we must absolutely stand by the plebiscite policy. Moving away from that would be a departure of our promise. I will keep my own counsel on this occasion, Peter, about where we should go to at the next election. That, you're right, that is something that the party room will have to discuss, and that's an issue which I think is best placed discussed in the party room. So I'll keep my own counsel on this.
Okay, that's fair enough. But would it be fair to say, at least, I mean, you can give me this at least, can't you? I can respect that you'll keep your own counsel. You don't want to sort of blather it out like Craig Kelly did last week with his position on this. But would it at least be fair to say that it's up for debate? I mean, once you've honoured this term, whether you stick with the plebiscite or you move to another policy, that's a fair debate to have ahead of the next election. That's reasonable, isn't it?
I mean, Peter, my view is that's a statement of the obvious, and it relates to every policy that we have, not just this one. Every policy is up for debate within the confines of the party room, and particularly as we get closer to a next election, although I still think it's probably further away rather than sooner. But either way, yes, of course, it's up for debate, as every issue is up for debate.
James Paterson, appreciate you joining us. Thanks for your company on Newsday.
Thank you, Peter.